Thanks, Erwin. Man, how in the heck am I supposed to follow that? Well, I guess we're going to liberate humanity with this brief and humble talk on leadership that matters. I met Erwin just last fall, was it? Or no, it was fall quarter. I'm a professor at Cal State Fullerton, but I'm also an adjunct professor at UC Irvine and Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And Erwin was this really quiet guy in the back row. I was wondering, what's up with this guy? He doesn't talk as much as I'd like to see in class, because when he did talk, it was always insightful. You know the type? You know the type? Well, Erwin turned in his first concise analysis, because there's a number of papers that he had to turn in. And I read that, and it's like, wow, this guy is off the chart in organizational skills. And you could just see it in his analysis, and here we got it today, right? How many people are going to organize a birthday seminar? So when he asked me to do this, and when we also, I think, Erwin, you back there? Where are you at? All right. Don't hide from me. Okay. If I remember, you said something about your faith in one of your papers, and that kind of flagged it for me. And I like to kind of stick out a little signal of my faith as well at the beginning of the semester. So that connection there, when Erwin asked me to talk at his birthday seminar, number one, I thought, how audacious to have a birthday seminar. I mean, this guy's got chutzpah, as they say, right? But then second, the faith connection, and that Erwin really wanted to kind of have a faith perspective as well in there. And I really resonated with that. And as it just so happened by providence, I suppose, I'm teaching a church Sunday school class in my church on leadership as well. So it nicely connected. But what we're going to be looking at today is a little bit more MBA-ish to kind of give the flavor of the MBA experience. So with that, we'll launch. But I'd like you to meet my family quickly. They can't be here. They're over at a birthday party today, this afternoon. Okay. It's my wife, though, Ian. My wife is Korean. And my kids, Matthew and Hannah. Matthew is in 6th grade, and Hannah is in 4th grade. And this is what I love to do in my spare time. Love family adventures. I also love to surf. And Erwin, the surf today is spectacular. And I am here right now, okay? So just so that you know how committed I am, right? It was tempting when I saw Surfline, but I'm here. All right, let's look quickly at the architecture for the 2 sessions that we're going to be doing. First, we're looking at leadership matters. And what we want to do here is we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the nature of leadership from primarily a psychological perspective. Then we're going to be looking at a biblical perspective on leadership as well by looking at a specific example or paradigm and comparing it to the theories that we're looking at. Session 2 is about making what we learn matter, making leadership matter. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually take on the role of a CEO of a large healthcare organization with about $8 billion in revenue. And we're going to hear from that CEO a problem that he faced in hiring somebody who was a real problem, a very senior level functional head, top level executive within this $8 billion organization. And he was facing the prospect that I might have made a hiring mistake. So he has to have a difficult conversation with this person. What we're going to do is we're going to, in our tables, discuss and apply some of the concepts that we learned. Just as far as game plan and rules of the game go as well, I want to make sure that it's open-ended here. If you have a question, if you're getting a little sleepy, get up, okay? Exercise a little bit. But if you have a question, feel free to interrupt, because I want to make this as interactive as possible, even though we have a pretty good-sized crowd here. All right, so let's think first about defining leadership. Now, as academic things go, we're always getting caught up in our own underwear, right, as academics. So over the last 60 years or so, no less than 65 classification systems have been developed to try to explain leadership. Over 300 definitions of leadership emerge over that period of time, too. But we do know that there's certain kind of broad-based themes over the history of leadership research that have emerged. And we're going to actually cover these 3 today. Trait-based perspective, this is what we call great person theory. And this is what our default is when we think about leadership, we tend to think about a leader. Skills-based perspective, which is about well, maybe we can actually develop the skills, knowledge, and ability to make us effective as a leader. Maybe leadership is something that we can train, not just something that is innate. And then transformational process, whereby followers are moved to accomplish more than is expected. And this is something we covered quite a bit in our organizational change class. So how do we define leadership, given this morass of frameworks and definitions? Let's take a pretty simple tack here, okay? Simply put, leadership is really this. It's a process of influence where individuals are moving groups or organizations to achieve some common goal, okay? So first of all, it's not a person. It's a process that we're talking about. That process can be distributed at times. And it's also a process that involves influence, persuasion, motivation, getting others energized to do stuff that they otherwise might not do. And it involves getting them on the same page so that they're all focusing on some common goals, right? Not a whole lot to think about there. Kind of fits our intuition, right? And that's what we're going to go with. But my question, and this is what I want to open it up to you to have some questions. My question for you as we get started is to think about, well, what drives leadership? What drives it? Is it our genes? Our chromosomes? Is it kind of something that's inherited? I want to hear from you on this. Is it our learning, the skills-based perspective? Or is it simply kind of the dumb luck of, I'm the boss, so I'm the leader, right? So ever had a boss like that? The boss is in charge, but not necessarily effective at managing people, right? That person is a leader, but are they engaged in leadership? What do you guys think? Where are the main drivers in this kind of equation of leadership effectiveness?
Vision.
What's that?
Vision.
Vision? Okay, but I'm talking about here, these three. Where would that vision come from? Are some people, so we're talking about genes. Is it innate? Is it a personality trait? Is it skills that you just purely learn? Is it just the fact that Mark Zuckerberg is CEO? Why? Because he started the company. That's why. Would he otherwise be CEO? Probably not, right? So what do you think? Where might that vision come from? Vision's an important aspect of leadership. Are some people inherently more visionary than others? What do you guys think? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Conviction from what is learned.
Conviction from what is learned. So you're going with a learning perspective? You think it's more learned?
I wouldn't want to choose one, but it sounds like what you're looking for.
Oh no, I'm not looking for a right or wrong answer here. There is no right or wrong answer.
Probably a
On this.
mixture of all of those aspects.
Okay, the hedging. That's a good way to approach it. Always a good way to approach it. Anybody have strong feelings, though, about traits? Some people are born leaders. Yeah.
I used to believe traits were a very important thing, but as I have encountered leaders that have different types of personalities and still effective in what they do, I'm starting to see that everyone has their own leadership style. It's just about cultivating it in a way to get people to believe in it.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. We'll look at some traits, for example, that are associated positively with leadership effectiveness in a little bit, but there are counterexamples of those, aren't there? Like we'll see extroversion as a quality that we normally consider as a leadership trait, but introverts could be leaders as well. We'll look at why that is. So that's an interesting perspective. Any other thoughts? It is, good answer, all three, right? But some recent research on heredity studies actually that looked at leadership emergence as well as basically whether a person is a leader in life in terms of their job or role and position. Looked at mainly inheritance, so genes, and they do this with twin studies. They compare identical twins with twins that are not identical genetically. And what they found, interestingly, is about 30% of the variation that predicts whether a person emerges as a leader is based on genetics, is trait-based. Now, that's not a hard and fast number, right? But what does it tell us? 30%? A lot? It's a lot, but you know what? You got 70% there. 70% to learn, 70% that could be associated with motivation, 70% could be associated with the positions that we find ourselves in, right? So we're not doomed to our genes, is the point that you made out, right? What drives effective leadership? So let's think about kind of what we call metrics or indicators of effectiveness. But actually, I want to think about examples first. So you guys remember, some of you I presume are church friends. You may remember. You remember these bracelets kids were wearing a while back? Maybe some of you were some of those kids wearing them. WWJD. Everybody remember that? What was that? What was that about? Huh? What would Jesus do? So kids were wearing these bracelets. What would Jesus do? And this is something that really kind of reflects our nature. We look to examples in leaders. Well, we're not talking about Jesus today. We will talk about someone else. But I'm thinking, hey, what would Jobs do? Okay? So you know the J is small, lowercase as well. So as we're going to go through these theories, we're going to, instead of doing it starting with the person and then working back, we'll present some theories and then we might ask ourselves, or I'm going to ask you to evaluate, how's Jobs stand up to this approach or this theory? But we can't just leave it at that, can we? Where is Erwin, by the way? He was sitting over here. You're like incognito. That's not fair. I can't say. Okay, he's manning the control room, as is good. We got to ask ourselves this. What would E30 do? What would E30 do? Okay, so we're going to ask that, Erwin. You got it? As we go through some of these, okay? All right, but in addition to Jobs, I want to take a biblical perspective as well. Jesus is kind of easy because he's sort of like Superman leader, right? And I want to look at somebody a little bit more fallible from a biblical perspective. So we'll take a biblical perspective by also looking at Moses, and we'll see how Moses measures up to some of these approaches. Any questions or comments as we head in? All right, let's jump in. All right, so when we think about effective leadership, we want to think about metrics, right? So what makes a leader effective? Here we want to look at objective and subjective metrics, okay? As we talked about, though, leadership is really about the process. The focus is on the actions, not the person, okay? Effective leadership involves forming and communicating shared goals, motivating others. It's a process, though we'll see traits do indeed matter. Effectiveness indicators are really subjective and objective. When we talk about subjective, we're primarily talking about the followers, us. You asked me if my dean at the College of Business is effective at Cal State Fullerton, right? I'm the one who's really, in effect, judging that from a subjective standpoint. My attitude, my motivation, if I'm energized and excited by the vision of my college, my dean's probably doing a good job. If I'm not, my dean is not necessarily doing a good job. Objective indicators are really more about performance, organizational, individual, group, and work. We could think about this in our family as well, though, right? Your family performs, your children performing well in school, performing well in life, performing well from an ethical and a moral standpoint. And then it's ultimately really about people fulfilling their potential. If you work with a leader who's effective, you are energized, you are psyched, you are pumped up. What would E30 do? Okay. So let's start out with traits. I'm going to jump into traits. The first trait we think about when we think about leaders is general mental ability or intelligence. Intelligence is important, right? We don't want to be led by somebody who's a little bit slow on the reuptake. Now, what's interesting about intelligence, though, is that although there is a correlation between perceived effectiveness, it kind of levels off. We don't want our leaders sort of way out there in the stratosphere in terms of intellectual ability. Why? Because it's a little harder potentially to relate to those people. We want a leader who's smart, but we want a leader that we can actually relate to. So what's interesting is the perception of intelligence is way more important, substantially, or at least significantly more important, rather, than actual IQ. So it's important that we at least have a confidence that our leaders have decent clock speed up there. When the leader's under stress, or if the leader's exercising a passive style in their leadership, the relationship between general mental ability and leadership effectiveness starts to go away. Big Five is another important aspect of personality or traits. Anybody here familiar with the Big Five model of personality? Anybody? No? Okay, so this is a common way that psychologists, particularly organizational psychologists, think about personality. And you can use the acronym OCEAN, okay, to summarize it. O refers to, am I open to new experiences? C refers to, am I organized, conscientious, punctual? E is extroversion. A is, am I an agreeable person? Do I like to get along with others, or do I like to debate and argue and disagree? And then N stands for neuroticism, and that has to do with not someone who's cuckoo in the head, but somebody who has a little bit of a difficult time controlling emotions, especially when they're under stress, or someone who might have a little bit of a negative mindset or mentality. Okay, so what we know in terms of Big Five is that we can distinguish what we'd call leadership emergence, someone rise up as a leader in a group or an organization, and then effectiveness. Once they're in that position, how good are they at what they do? Conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness, all associated with emergence. I forgot a sign here on agreeableness. Agreeableness actually is not a positive relationship. It's a negative relationship. Now, why do you think that might be? Why do you think that might be? Why do you think that we think about someone as a leader if they're not that agreeable?
Agreeable people are too easily swayed.
Right. We want somebody who's sort of taking a stand, drawing a line, stating a position. Now, it can go a little bit overboard. We don't want somebody who's pugnacious and totally disagreeable. But in emergence, leaders often distinguish themselves by disagreeing, or at least not necessarily going with the flow. Extroversion and openness tend to be overall the most important for general effectiveness. So now let's think about what would jobs do. How's jobs measure up, do you think, on the intelligence scale? Anybody? Yeah? I mean, he's a pretty smart guy, right? Self-educated, didn't go to college, but incredibly, a really bright guy, right? Conscientiousness, what are your thoughts on that? Conscientious guy?
Very detail focused.
Very detailed focus. In fact, I don't know if you've heard the story. What's your name?
Jason.
Jason, okay, I need binoculars. You forgot the binoculars or one so I can see people's name tags. So I remember hearing a story of him fixing a fence with his dad. And his dad emphasized to Steve that when you're fixing the fence, it's just as important to make sure the back looks good as it is to make sure the front looks good. That type of conscientious mentality was really instilled in him. So when you look at the back of your iPhone, when you look at I'm looking at the back of an Apple computer, you see a nice piece of machinery, right? This is really a reflection of that. Extroversion. You think of Steve Jobs as an extrovert? What do you guys think? I see a head nodding. Why? Any comment on that? No comment. Not an extrovert, no comment. You're not an extrovert either. That's okay. Right? I don't think about Jobs as an extrovert. He was a little bit more of a recluse. He liked his privacy. Drove around always without a license plate on his vehicle. He traded his Mercedes convertible in every 6 months for that very reason. So he never had to have a license. Because you need a license in the state of California if you've driven your car 6 months. All right. Openness? What do you think? Open-minded guy? Open to new experiences? Yeah, probably. Certainly had a lot of interesting ideas. So we could see, maybe high on conscientiousness. How about agreeableness? Not such an agreeable guy, right? Now it's interesting, we see that in emergence, but we don't see it in effectiveness. It doesn't sort of propel. Let's do a quick one on Irwin. How's Irwin fit? The Big Five model. Conscientiousness? Oh man, off the scale, Irwin. Man, you got that thing nailed. Okay. Extroversion? No? Really? Okay. Interesting. But look at what a non-extroverted person can pull off in terms of a social gathering. Whew. All right. Openness? Yeah. Oh, come on. Give the guy some credit. Agreeableness? No. A leader who is emerging to lead us through the alien invasion. And obviously, Erwin is a really bright guy. Okay? He invited all of you. So, all right. So let's look at a few others now. Assertiveness. This is an interesting one. Think about an inverse curvilinear relationship, kind of like a bell curve. One side, you got the person who's really pushy. On the other side, you got the person who's not very assertive at all. What do we think of that really pushy person as? Call out some adjectives. Jerks. What else? Annoying. Bossy. We can even use expletives, but we won't. We'll refrain from that. There may be some of that in the video. How about on the other side? Pushover. Lazy. Actually, we have a word for that. Laissez-faire is that style of leadership, which sounds a lot like lazy, but just means kind of kick back, make it happen, right? So with some recent research on experimental and field research on assertiveness has showed there is a sweet spot, and it may vary from organization to organization, but leaders really need to be assertive, but not too assertive, so that you're viewed as pushy, but not so kind of laid back that you're viewed as lazy or laissez-faire. The key to finding that balance is in your assertiveness, listening to others' opinions and being open to kind of new ideas and experiences. How's Erwin fit on that one? What do you guys think? We're not going to do this for every one of them, Erwin, okay? So I think he's actually in the nice balance there. Again, it's going to vary from organization to organization, but narcissism. So this is, in its extreme form, a psychiatric disorder, okay, in the DSM-3. It's this notion of inflated superiority. We've all probably encountered at different times narcissists. I was watching Iron Man 2 with my kids last night, and we all know Tony Stark as a narcissist, right? He even accepts that of himself in that show, in that movie. The interesting thing about narcissism and leadership is, first of all, there's been some empirical work that's been done on narcissistic CEOs and financial performance of the firm. And what they actually found was they're able to code narcissism very creatively by looking at the verbiage and the verbal constructs in annual reports. And what they found was a negative predictive relationship, that the more narcissistic the CEO was, the worse the financial performance of the firm was. This might explain why. Leaders who are narcissistic don't view themselves as narcissistic. They view themselves as agreeable, open-minded, and often conscientious. Followers, on the other hand, view them as you're just a narcissist. You don't have any of these qualities. You're not conscientious. You may be a little bit open at times, but you're definitely not agreeable. We won't even go there with Erwin, because I don't think you fit this category at all. But let's think about jobs for a moment, right? What do you think? Where might jobs have fit into this model in both assertiveness and narcissism? Anybody?
Very assertive.
Very assertive, right? Yeah, not known for his people skills in that regard. He's known to humiliate people in meetings and things like that. Certainly not known to listen to others' opinions. How about on the narcissist kind of front? This isn't all about, kicking the guy when he's no longer with us or here to defend himself, but let's be honest.
Very narcissistic.
They're narcissistic. What example comes to mind?
How about just getting that person to write a book about him?
Getting someone to write a book about you? Okay, that could be one example. You're holding the phone wrong. Yeah, there's a number of anecdotes. I knew somebody who actually worked at Pixar indirectly, but there are anecdotes that fly around out there that would at least suggest or indicate that he was a little bit narcissistic in terms of his own personality. I think as he reached his own mortality, that he started to actually humble himself quite a bit more and potentially even found some restructuring or changing in his personality. Okay, now we look at classic factors. So the trait approaches started to get worn thin, although some of these trade approaches still exist. But sometime around in the 1950s, researchers at Ohio State University in particular, but also at University of Michigan and Harvard Business School, began to try to think about, well, what can we do to train leaders to help them be more effective? And what they found were two key factors. And to illustrate this, I have Erwin's there, somebody there? Can I have somebody just go ahead and click this, click it, and if you can move it to 1 minute and 42 seconds. Okay, so click the video and then move me to 1 minute and 42 seconds. Sorry, click the picture. So move me to 1 minute 42 and then just pause it. I wish I could grab it. Pull it over. There we go. 142. Pause. All right. And we'll need sound. I'm not sure how that's working, but if you could just pause it for now, that's good, and I'll just set it up. So this is a brief clip from a film, Crimson Tide. Do we have any comic book nerds out here? Awesome. Okay, you Silver Surfer fan? Not really, not Silver Surfer. Okay, because this is a clip that pertains to the Silver Surfer comic book. But in any case, so this is a movie, Crimson Tide, and in this movie, Denzel Washington is the XO on a nuclear submarine. So that's like the COO of the ship. He encounters a crewman who just got into a scuffle over who was the true Silver Surfer illustrator, whether it was Mobius or Kirby. Apparently, it's quite a controversy for comic book folks. So we're going to see him engage in two broad classifications of behavior. I'd like you to watch carefully and think about what are the two behaviors that he is kind of demonstrating here. So we have sound now, hopefully?
Hey, what's up?
Good.
I'm sorry, sir. It's just a difference of opinion that got out of hand.
What about?
It's really too silly to talk about, so I'd rather just forget
I
about
don't give a damn about what you'd rather forget about. Why were you two fighting?
Well, I said that the Kirby Silver Surfer was the only real Silver Surfer, and that the Mobius Silver Surfer was shit. And Benefield's a big Mobius fan. Things got out of hand. I pushed him, he pushed me. I lost my head, sir. I'm sorry.
Bennen, you're a supervisor. You can get a commission like that.
I know it, sir. You're 100% right. It's never happen again.
It better not happen again. I see this kind of nonsense, I'm gonna write you up. You understand? Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
You have to set an example even in the face of stupidity. Now, everybody that reads comic books knows that Kirby Silver Surfer is the only true Silver Surfer. Now, am I right or wrong?
You're right, sir.
All right, get out of here.
Yes, sir.
All right, you can cut it.
Feels like the whole crew needs a kick in the ass.
Sorry, you can cut it. Didn't mean that part to show up. All right. So what kind of behavior did you see? You saw two types of interactions, right? What was the first interaction that he has with the crewman? Anybody? Assertiveness, okay. So elaborate a little bit for me.
Him telling him exactly how he should be acting as a supervisor.
Excellent. So he's giving him instruction. He's creating structure for his role, right? Communicating. Even reprimanding him, right? Kind of being a little bit harsh on him. How about the second type of behavior we see towards the end? What's he doing there? Okay, he's being funny, but elaborate a little bit more. What's special about him being funny in that interaction? What's that? Yes, exactly. He's building the relationship through that. Now, imagine a scenario where you reverse the order. What would that be like? You know, making a little joke and then pounding the guy, right? Wouldn't work that way. So the ordering is actually important. These are the two classifications of behaviors that they found in the Ohio State and the other studies. And they're called the classic factors. The first one's initiating structure. That's what we saw. That's about the roles, goals, and communication, right? Setting the agenda. Second one are what are called follower consideration or person-oriented behaviors. This is about showing concern, respect, making that connection with the subordinate, in this case, over who the true Silver Surfer comic illustrator is, right? Now, what's interesting about these approaches, they kind of got lost and they kind of got forgotten. As the decades went on, a lot of research was done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s on these, and then research continued, but they started to get a bum rap. And they were given this bum rap all the way up till like the early 2000s or so, until Tim Judge, who's a well-known organizational psychologist at Notre Dame, began to study them. And he did a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is where you take a huge bunch of studies, you put them in a bucket, and you treat them like they're one gigantic, massive monster study. And what he found was that the classic factors are indeed highly effective. Okay? In particular, as you might imagine, the initiating structure is more predictive of performance. Okay? Works a little bit better, whereas the consideration is more about follower motivation and satisfaction. So we perform better when the boss kind of holds us accountable and puts our feet to the fire. We feel more energized and motivated and satisfied when the boss demonstrates respect for us. The key idea here is that you really need both of these. Now let's go to jobs. How's these stack up? Initiating structure. What do you think?
Strong.
Very strong. Why is that? Why do you think he would be strong there?
You just care so much about how things are done, getting them done the right way.
Yeah, so, and as you mentioned, very conscientious, very detail-oriented, right? So he's very, very much into the structure. How about follower consideration?
Not so much.
Not so much there, right? But we see really a lot of performance, right? But people who worked with him were known to either love him or hate him. They'd be either energized by the vision of what he had to do, but it was often said that as he walked down the halls in Cupertino at Apple headquarters, a wave of resentment would follow him, okay? Because a lot of people didn't care for him personally for that reason. Erwin, initiating structure. Out of the park, man. Come on, look at this, right? This shows right here. This is what he does well. Follower consideration. What do you think?
He does that well, too.
He does that well. Erwin, you are a likable guy, okay? We are here to like you. Lots of variation, though, across individual studies, meaning that there's different kind of contextual moderators. So if you have a boss who's a jerk, tries to be considerate, not going to work so well. You're going to view that as disingenuous, right? Okay, so now we move into the transformational, which is a more contemporary approach. Transformational leadership started with this notion of what's called the full range model of leadership. And it starts with the laissez model that you talked about earlier, or laissez-faire. We move from laissez-faire leadership, which is hands-off. Any of you ever had a boss like that, totally hands-off? Anybody? Is that satisfying? Usually not. It depends. Sometimes it's nice to have hands-off. Professors like that type of leadership, by the way. We like leaders in schools that are hands-off, so we could kind of call our own shots. But in most business organizations, not so much. So you move from hands-off to what's called management by exception. That's the next kind of level. And that's the manager, the leader, who jumps in when there's a problem. Okay? Things are running smoothly, you never hear from him or her. Something hiccups, he swoops in to solve the problem, to solve the day. Contingent rewards is that handshake. You've got an economic relationship between the boss and the subordinate, and it's all about you do this and you get this in reward. It's a transaction, an economic financial transaction. Okay? People were kind of dissatisfied with this type of typical approach to leadership, so they came up with a new model that accounted for leaders that are more charismatic or energizing. And this is what transformational leadership is about. 4 dimensions. Inspirational vision. So transformational leaders give us something to be excited about. Intellectual stimulation. They challenge us to do more than we thought we could have done otherwise. Individual consideration. Sounds familiar? It's what we just saw in the prior theory. Same basic idea. You feel like that person cares about you. Bill Clinton was great at this. If politics aside, whether you love him or hate him, he was always very good at making people feel understood or empathized with. And then idealized influence, which is viewing the leader as a role model. Let's think about jobs on this one. Let's just focus on transformational. Inspirational vision. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Yeah, Absolutely, especially in terms of, the things that he developed, the innovations, highly inspiring. This is what would get people energized. Intellectual stimulation. Now, I know nobody really reported here to Steve Jobs, so it's a little difficult to make that assessment. But what's your hunch?
Yeah, he pushed people.
He pushed people to do a lot more than he did. There's a story about him as well when he was getting the Apple to boot up more quickly. Anybody ever heard this story?
Yeah.
You got it. He was asking someone to get it to boot up more quickly, and they said, this is the best I can do. And he said, now I'd like you to imagine that somebody's life is saved because the machine boots up more quickly. Now go do that. And he got him to get it done, right? It's all about framing, intellectual stimulation. Individual consideration? Not so much. Yeah, we saw that earlier. And then idealized influence. Yeah, that's an iffy. Probably not. For some, those who knew him probably didn't want to be like him in terms of his interpersonal, but those of us who saw what he did and his innovation and so forth, we all continue to admire him, and rightly so. So, transformational theories. Actually, we're going to look at a quick example of this one as well. So, can you tap this? Before you tap it, let me just set up the example. So here we're going to see an example of transformational leadership from another Denzel Washington movie. I love Denzel Washington, so I like to bring in his movies. From Remember the Titans. Any of you ever seen that film? So in Remember the Titans, you've got two high schools that were formerly enemies, primarily white high school and primarily black high school. And during forced desegregation of the schools, they're merged to become one high school and one football team. And they're having a hugely difficult time getting along. So Coach Boone, who is Denzel Washington plays, takes the team out for an early morning jog in rural Pennsylvania. And this is what we get to see. So go ahead and click the picture of Denzel. We had sound last time. Sound okay? Working on the sound. Doesn't work, that's okay. There we go. Perfect.
Anybody know what this place is? This is Gettysburg. This is where they fought the Battle of Gettysburg. 50,000 men died right here on this field, fighting the same fight that we're still fighting amongst ourselves today. This green field right here, painted red, bubbling with blood, young boys, smoke, and hot lead pouring right through their bodies. Listen to their souls, man. I killed my brother with malice in my heart, hatred, destroyed my family. You listen. You take a lesson from the dead. If we don't come together right now on this hollow ground, we too will be destroyed. Just like they were. I don't care if you like each other or not, but you will respect each other. And maybe, I don't know, maybe you will learn to play this game like men.
Thank you. Inspirational vision, right? He's appealing to common values. They're bigots, but nobody believes in slavery anymore. So he's appealing to a common denominator and a common value. Whoops. What happened there? Intellectual stimulation. He's challenging them. Individual consideration. He's running right alongside of them. He's not telling them to run and then showing up in the golf cart later on, right? And then idealized influence. He's trying to model for them what the values and the priorities are for the team. Did we hear anything about winning? Is winning what the goal is that he's shooting for? No, he's not shooting for winning. He's shooting for being a team. And then maybe he says, we'll learn to play like men. Maybe we'll be able to win some games. But right now, it's not about winning. It's about having that common vision and that common goal. So, what's your hunch? Which is more effective, transformational or transactional leadership? Transformational. But believe it or not, transactional has some effectiveness as well. First of all, though, taking a step back, some have actually even gone as far as to say that transactional and transformational leadership are really more granular interpretations of the two classic factors. So if you think about the transactional approach, it's really about structuring work. If you think about the transformational approach, it's really about energizing and motivating followers, right? So that's kind of a nice way to think about those two theories. We know that the more passive the transactional styles, such as laissez-faire, or even management by exception, passive and active mode, the more passive the style, it tends to correlate negatively with leader effectiveness. So passive leadership really doesn't work very effectively. Transactional leadership is actually a little bit more effective than transformational leadership when it comes to leader job performance. Very slightly when it comes to follower job satisfaction. That one's a little bit controversial. Transformational, on the other hand, though, is definitely more effective as it pertains to, say, satisfaction with the leader and leader effectiveness. More specifically, when we look at transformational leadership, we know that the inspiring vision is really where the greatest impact is. The key idea here with transformational is that the mechanism by which that is effective, that style of leadership, is that followers view the work as meaningful and impactful and purposeful, much like we saw in the example of the video. Okay, so we're going to look at one last approach, and then we'll jump into Moses. If you think we need a break, I'm happy to take a break before Moses as well, because we're going a little long, going a little longer than we anticipated. So substitutes for leadership was a notion that was brought up during kind of a dearth of leadership theory. There was a period in the 80s and even into the 90s when leadership theory was kind of bleak in organizational studies and organizational psychology. People were questioning whether there was even such a thing as leadership, if you could believe that. So someone came up with this notion of substitutes for leadership. And to illustrate this, we're going to look at an orchestra called Orpheus. Anybody here ever heard of Orpheus Chamber Orchestra? No? So what's distinct about Orpheus Chamber Orchestra is they do not have a conductor. So in effect, they are without a leader. What we're going to do is we want to see how they can still be effective without a so-called leader. I want to ask you the question, as we see the example from Orpheus, are they really without a leader, or is there really no leadership going on in that situation? The substitute for leadership theorists would say that, well, we don't really need leaders or leadership when the task is structured, when procedures are well established, and when the workers are highly skilled, such as these highly skilled musicians who are able to kind of fend for themselves. So with that, why don't we click the photograph, and we'll jump into this. Hopefully the sound's working for us. Very good, thanks. So tell me if leadership is happening here or not.
Just a little faster. I wish that the foot were more grand and more, dignified. One of those. 101 or 101.
The Orpheus model was never boring. The idea of Orpheus is that we take symphonic repertoire, play with chamber music techniques. And what that means is basically that the musicians take over the role of the conductor.
Each one of us is as responsible as a conductor for having an interpretation, knowing the score, and being able to discuss those ideas with your colleagues. That's something that's very unusual in an orchestra setting.
While it's very exciting, it's also a real challenge to come out with a conclusion
and a plan for execution. There needs to be a clear chain of command. You've got to have defined roles, and you really need to create a group consciousness.
It starts out with just the core of players who are the principal players for that particular piece, which is different for every piece. And once that gets developed within the chamber music group, the small group, it's then transferred to the large group. And that's one of the most difficult moments, is to take the small group's concepts and see how it's going to work with the bigger group.
And the group as a whole may sometimes reject some of their ideas, argue, question, deepen. And so every member in the rehearsal process and on stage absolutely has a say.
I'd like to tell the story of when I first played with Orpheus. The very first time, I was very young, and I'm standing in the doorway very shyly because, as I say, I didn't know anybody. And I see people are laughing, they're telling jokes to each other, people are playing licks for each other, playing things on the violin, just chaos everywhere. And I found that absolutely amazing, that we can start from nothing and end up with something that people really want to hear and that we all enjoy so much.
So is Orpheus leaderless? What do you think? Are they without leadership?
Not necessarily.
No? Tell me why.
Well, you can see there, within the group, there's already a certain kind of leadership there.
Uh-huh.
Right? And then whatever their concepts or ideas come out, they bring them together. So it's, but they do all get to pitch in, so it's kind of...
So the leadership, what you're describing is the leadership is emerging in that role. We think about orchestras as normally having a top-down hierarchy where you have a conductor telling people how to play a piece and how to interpret. Here, it's just a bottom-up leadership process, right? So the question that we ask with the substitute for leadership approach is, sure, you've got these skilled workers and established procedures and so forth, but where does it come from? It comes from leadership, prior leadership, in the case of Orpheus, right? So the idea of substitutes for leadership sort of has, it's still out there. There's still people pursuing those lines of research, but to date, they haven't been able to kind of really make the case in a compelling manner. All right, so let's kind of recap where we've gotten to so far. We've looked at trait approaches. We've seen for general mental ability, IQ, perception is important, more important than reality, although there is a correlation between GMA and leader effectiveness. We've looked at extroversion, openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness as key big five predictors. Moderate assertiveness, narcissism negatively predicts leadership. In skills, we've seen these two broad classes of skills, initiating structure and follower consideration, and these have been interpreted more recently from a transformational and a transactional approach. Generally speaking, transformational tends to be more effective than transactional, although transactional still holds people accountable and is related to performance. Substitutes for leadership, not so much, because the skills and the processes and the procedures that are supposed to replace leadership actually imply that leadership exists somewhere in order to create those. So we want to move now into an example from the scripture. And what I want to do now, instead of evaluating Steve Jobs, is we're going to actually make a similar evaluation with Moses, and we might even pull Jesus in just a little bit, but not too much. So why do we want to look at Moses? Well, he's imperfect, maybe, but we could probably, most of us, argue that he was a fairly effective leader. He, despite a number of setbacks, had a huge task. In fact, if you look at the biblical narrative, Moses was incredibly reluctant. When God calls him at the burning bush, what does he do? Does he jump on it and say, "Oh yeah, Lord, I'm gung-ho, let's go for it"? Anybody? No, not at all. In fact, what ensues is an argument between Moses and God where Moses comes up with one excuse after another. I don't have them counted. I think there's about 5 or 6 of these interactions between Moses and God where, oh, but, what if they do this? What if they do that? So he is reluctant. And the people themselves are reluctant. So he had a huge leadership task, yet he was obviously effective. Okay? So let's think about his traits for starters. Intelligence. So Moses was probably educated in the royal courts of Egypt, probably the best education at that time that you could get. Certainly he was under a lot of stress. He needed Aaron's help and Aaron's support. Aaron was in fact his mouthpiece. So the successes that we see seem to be at least somewhat independent of IQ. Though it was also probably very important that he communicated that he was of able mental ability for those who were following him. For personality, if you think about conscientiousness, probably pretty high on conscientiousness. He was persistent in what he did. Openness, perhaps. Neuroticism, also perhaps. What we see is Moses is a pretty stressed out guy. Now, obviously, has a hugely stressful task, but he's not even able to communicate. Some think that he probably even had a stuttering problem. But in any case, he needed his Aaron to be his mouthpiece. So chances are he had a little bit of a difficult time with kind of emotion. Extroversion, also actually probably a little bit lower, not as comfortable in front of crowds. And then agreeableness, that one not quite as clear. There are some actual early signs of narcissism, though, which is kind of interesting to consider with Moses. The fact that he murdered the Egyptian is sort of indicative of him having a little bit more of a delusion of grandeur, thinking that he could get away with something that he really couldn't have gotten away with. So there may be some potential early signs of narcissism, but over time those start to wither away. As he shows humility, he begins to kind of rely more on God for wisdom, action, and instruction. In terms of the classic factors, initiating structure, we probably have to say that he measures up pretty well there. He had to. But he was also overwhelmed by a lot of challenges. There's some passages in Exodus and Numbers where Moses is sitting down as a judge, and people are lining up, kind of like jury duty, and giving their disputes to Moses, and he is individually judging each dispute. His father-in-law comes along and says, "You're crazy. What are you doing this for? You're totally going to burn yourself out. What you need to do is you need to delegate to some other able-bodied men who are full of wisdom and full of the Spirit to mete out judgment with these disputes." Okay? So he's able to finally figure that out with a little bit of help, but probably pretty good at initiating structure. Follower consideration? Probably so. There's a number of situations where he finds himself in debate with God, where God is angry at Israel for making the golden calf shortly after the 10 Commandments are given. They quickly revert into pagan practice. And God burns with anger to destroy the children of Israel, and Moses intercedes on their behalf. So he shows compassion and concern. Though some of those attempts seem to fail, and he does at times get exasperated himself. It didn't necessarily guarantee effective outcomes, even when he was showing that follower consideration. Transformational leadership. He does appeal to a common sense of historic identity. So he does very well at showing them a promised future. And then in terms of transactional relationship, the covenant between God and the children of Israel is very much a transaction. And there's a portion in the book of Deuteronomy, it's very vivid, where he has people standing on the mountains. And he's kind of pronouncing to them blessings and cursings if they are to follow God's law or if they are to violate God's law. Essentially, he's discussing the transaction between Israel and God in that situation. So there's something to be said about transactional leadership there. If this, then that. This is called apodictic law in kind of biblical studies. So in terms of his legacy, if we look at it from a substitutes for leadership perspective, it's a little difficult to kind of assess some of these factors, but he did, after all, start a nation, even though he was hampered by upbringing in a life of slavery. Nonetheless, and even as an orphan, he still was able to overcome a lot of those difficulties. So what we see is a little bit of convergence between psychological and at least our biblical example when we look explicitly just at Moses. Some of the important convergences are consideration of follower needs and differences, providing this sense of vision and common identity, and being hardworking and open to new ideas. What's a little bit less clear, at least in the case of Moses, is the role of intelligence, and certainly extroversion was not necessarily something that Moses was good at. It's interesting, actually, we didn't talk about this with trait theory, but the relationship between extroversion and leader effectiveness relies on social skills. Because we all know leaders, or rather, we all know extroverts, maybe some of you know some, who are highly extroverted, but don't necessarily have social skills. Those aren't people that we view as leaders. So the idea of extroversion resulting in leadership requires that one acquire those social skills. Introverts are just as able to acquire some of those social skills. There's some divergence, though. And we see this more in the New Testament, particularly with Jesus, in this notion of servant leadership. To be fair, there's actually a burgeoning academic area known as servant leadership that's being researched and studied right now. But Jesus turns kind of the hierarchy topsy-turvy when the disciples are debating about who's the greatest. He says, actually, the greatest is the one who is to be the least among you. So there is some divergence when we think about humility. We don't necessarily put that together with leadership. But from a scriptural or a biblical perspective, those two actually do go together. Transformational leadership is also very popular. Transactional leadership kind of takes a back seat. But when we look at the example with Moses, and even some examples with Jesus, we see actually that this notion of follower accountability and responsibility is very important. So it may be that transformational leadership is a little bit overrated from that perspective. The other issue is about follower needs. So we talked about follower consideration, individual consideration. Sure, it's important to address followers' needs, but we have to ask ourselves, what do followers need? We have a variety of needs, right? We need power, we need prestige, we have extrinsic needs, financial needs, but there's also intrinsic needs. And there's a whole class of theories on intrinsic motivation that's really about the three needs that we have: autonomy, the need to kind of make choices, the need to be good at what we do, competence, and the need to have meaningful relationships. What about spiritual needs? Spiritual needs are also inherently intrinsic, and they are universal. To what extent is the leader there to fulfill spiritual needs? Believe it or not, even in organizational behavior, there's a growing kind of literature on spirituality and leadership. It's even become a division within the Academy of Management now, is that there's genuine psychological study of spirituality and leadership. And the reason is because people are beginning to understand it's an important component. So let's think some key takeaways in. We're wrapping up here, part one. We've looked at how psychological findings mostly match our intuitions and speculations. Extroversion and intelligence maybe not quite as key from a biblical perspective. Structure gets things done. Consideration is about listening to others to get people motivated. Both of those are needed. We really need that balance. But there's some important differences, and those differences, I think, really converge around the need for followers to view themselves as responsible. It's not all about the leader. That's where transactional leadership also is important, as well as the centrality of humility, at least within, especially a New Testament framework or perspective. All right, so that wraps up session one. I want to open for questions if anyone had any questions before we go ahead and take a break. Anybody? Yeah. How does it apply to people who are not natural leaders? So the inherent in that question is the notion that it's really more about traits. And what I'd encourage folks to think about is everyone in this room is a leader or has leadership responsibility in some way. So then it becomes an issue of skills and acquiring those skills. And the way to think about that, I think the simplest way is to think about the follower consideration and the initiating structure skills that we talked about, and really focusing on developing and building those skills.
How is it possible to be too assertive but not a narcissist?
How's it possible to be too assertive
But not a narcissist?
Well, that's an interesting question. Do you mean finding that balance of being assertive?
I just think the two are related. How are they not related? If you're too assertive, how are you not a narcissist?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure about the relationship of the two. I didn't assert that they were not related. We looked at them as separate traits, right? We know that narcissism negatively is related to leadership effectiveness, and being too assertive is also negatively related to leadership effectiveness. Whether being too assertive and narcissistic are related to one another, I'm not as sure about that. They very well might be. It's an interesting hypothesis. I would imagine a lot of narcissists, I mean, when you think about narcissists, they are pushy, they push their agenda, and they step over other people. So I think it does make sense to think of them as being overly assertive. Anyone else? All right. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm going to jump down here. Oh, the key difference between transformational and servant leadership. That's a very good question. We didn't get into servant leadership, right? But the main idea of servant leadership is that you're kind of taking the hierarchy and putting it on its head, topsy-turvy. Because the idea of servant leadership comes from a passage in Scripture where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And the reason this was completely shocking to the disciples is that it was unacceptable for anyone except a Gentile slave to wash someone's feet. So not only would a Jew never wash another Jew's feet, not only would a Gentile not even be expected to wash someone's feet, but you had to be the status of a slave, someone's property, in order to wash someone's feet. So Jesus actually takes on that status, which is completely shocking to the disciples. So the main idea there is he's turning the hierarchy on its head, and he's saying that as your leader, I'm here to serve and support you, not to tell you what to do. Transformational leadership is a little bit more of a top-down idea and mentality that involves crafting a vision, setting direction, and it has a more kind of conventional feel to it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And so this is, we didn't get into this, but this addresses the issue of what's called contingency or situational leadership. We could talk about a lot of these approaches that Jesus exhibited, right? I totally agree. He exhibited transformational leadership and servant leadership and a number of other leadership qualities. So, but it would vary by the situation. You think about his condemnation of the Pharisees, he was actually very transactional and very hard-lined and aggressive with those who were, in his view, on a wrong path. But for those who were most in need of being healed, he was actually very supportive and loving, especially to the outcast. Good question. Yeah.
How do you feel about our current president as a leader? I feel like he has a lot of great traits, but at the same time, people are running out of time. I would like to be.
That's a good question. I don't know if I want to be politically oriented. I'm happy to have sidebar conversations. I don't want to use this as an opportunity, but I think from just an objective standpoint, if you think about what he inherited, I think he's done a fairly decent job. That's my own personal opinion. But everyone is subject to critique and criticism, and the president's no exception. But I'm happy to talk one-on-one. Anyone else? All right, thanks everybody. We'll be back in a bit for part 2.
Thank you, Professor.